Acts chapter 17. Paul has finished his what we think of as a sermon. Probably the Athenians in the Areopagus would have just thought of it as a speech or a talk. At the end of his talk, he explains, and he doesn't really explain, but he proposes that God has set a time for judgment, and that he's appointed a person to be the judge, and that person was one who had been raised from the dead. And the only one that is Jesus. It's obvious that to us that Paul's talking about Jesus. Well, some of the Areopagus just sneered at that. Come on. But others were very curious about it and asked him, we want to hear about this again from you. So Paul left the council, and in verse 34, some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus. So the Areopagus met at a location, but it was a group. And you didn't just show up and say, I'd love to be a part of this group. No, you became a part of this group on the basis of being accepted by these intellectuals and philosophical people. Well, okay. Also, a woman named Damaris and a number of others. Now, Dionysius and Damaris, they don't show up anywhere else in the New Testament. This is it. And sometimes I wonder, why did Luke include the names of these people? Was he just name dropping? Well, I don't think so much name dropping as throughout in both his gospel account, right, and the book of Acts, both written by Luke to noble Theophilus, he offers historical signposts. In other words, these are real people, and you can follow up with these real people to verify what I'm writing. I just think that's interesting. On to chapter 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Now, Corinth is not a long journey from Athens, but it's a journey. There he met a Jew. It's not hard for me to imagine how he met the Jew. On two levels. I'm going to see one of the levels in a minute, but one level is Paul's habit was to go to the synagogue and engage people there. Well, you're going to meet a number of Jewish men at the synagogue. Well, Aquila was, I think, one of the guys that he met there, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, again, you get this historical marker, right? Okay. There was this historical moment. It was more than a moment, but in terms of the vastness of history, a moment when a persecution of the Jews occurred in the form of being required to leave Rome. As Americans, we can't even imagine what that would have been like. But Priscilla and Aquila, wife and husband, they left Rome and they wound up in Corinth. Then Luke continues, Paul went to see them because he was a tent maker as they were. He stayed and worked with them. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase of referring to bivocational pastors, which is that's people who are pastors and they have a career in the marketplace or in the world of business, or they are an artisan, or they do ministry and they support themselves to a large degree, and some 100% by this other work that they do to enable them and make it possible for them to do ministry. Okay. And sometimes they're called tent makers. Paul, I'm trying to think of what would be an industry or business today that would connect with tent making in century one, and I almost can't. Well, in this moment, I can't. Tent making was constantly in demand. A little bit maybe like an auto mechanic. There are people who think, gas-powered cars are going away. I'm not one of them. And if it happens, it's not happening anytime soon. And as long as there are gas-powered cars, we're going to need mechanics. That's the way tent makers were in century one. Even if you lived in the city, you probably had a tent, especially if you were a Jew. You wanted a tent, at least for the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, maybe not a tent, because a strict observance of the Feast of Tabernacles was you would construct a small shelter and live in there, sleep in there. That would be your home for the days of the Feast of Tabernacles. But tents were everywhere, and awnings were everywhere. And so a tent maker would stay pretty much as busy as an auto mechanic today. Okay, Paul was a tent maker. This is interesting to me because we don't. This is the first time this has come up. We don't know how he became a tent maker, how he was apprenticed into this industry. We're going to figure out as we move through. We already have figured out a little bit about Paul's background. He was highly educated. So what would have amounted to at least a college education, but probably more likely a master's degree or higher in terms of the Jewish educational system. And that we know, he studied with Gamaliel. We don't know who he studied with to become a tent maker. Doesn't even matter. But he was. And he connected with Aquila and Priscilla because they were tent makers, and he worked with them and stayed with them in Corinth. Verse 4, every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. This idea of reasoning in the synagogue, this is not new. It's come up most of the time whenever Luke records any of Paul's engagements with synagogues. He reasoned with them. I'm trying to search for words that won't be too accusatory here. Sometimes churches are all reason and no emotion. sometimes churches are all emotion and no reason. I want a balance. I want reasons. I don't want to just have the feelings. But I went through a period of time where I rejected feelings and I thought reason was the only thing. And that didn't work, because there's a part of all of us that is connected to our emotions, whether we want that or not. And when reason connects with emotion, there's this noble balance, even a partnership of thought and feeling that give us a basis to understand and engage and grow in faith. Well, Paul, I don't think Paul was this big emotional, I'm going to finish up with a poem and a story about a little boy who lost his dog. I don't think that's how he did it. I think, well, number one, Paul, boy, read Romans and you get the impression pretty easily. Paul was a very systematic thinker, very nearly a lawyer type guy. He saw things in this logical order, building one thing upon another. And I think that's how he reasoned. And why I feel like I had to tell you that, I don't even know. But here was his point. He's trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. That little two words, and Greeks, we're seeing it, not just here. By this time, I don't know whether these were Judaized Greeks who had gone through a proselytization conversion to Judaism, or whether they were merely curious Greeks, Gentiles, who were somehow engaged with the synagogue. A very strict Jewish synagogue would really not have had a visitor's gallery for Gentiles. It would have been Jews only. I wonder if in Corinth they had kind of been more liberal and open. Anyway, the door had opened for Gentiles to hear about and come to the grace of God through Christ. Started with Peter and the household of Cornelius, and then began to spread. This, for us as modern Gentiles, is a given. But it was not yet a given at this point. And so the fact that Greeks were included, well, that was no small thing. And as Luke records his account, he keeps coming back to it, because in his day, that was big. Oh, okay. I'm going to shut it down. I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.